Gentlemen, Mr. Brian Lewandowski.
All right, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Fred, for the invitation to speak today. I will assume that you can see my slides. Ian, please let me know if you cannot.
I can, yes.
Okay, so this is a presentation about an energy study that I conducted in Minnesota last year, and we really wrapped it up this spring. The study period really predates the COVID conversation, so just sort of keep that in mind as I go through some of my slides. To kick this off, just remember that most coal-fired capacity was built between 1950 and 1990 in this country. The capacity weighted average age of operating coal facilities is 39 years. So as these facilities are depreciating out, what we see is they're being replaced with alternative energy sources. It could be natural gas, it could be wind, solar, battery storage, just a whole gamut of possible replacement energy sources. So just to frame this a little bit, I want to provide you with a quick perspective on the size of the Minnesota economy. So overall, in 2019, Minnesota's GDP was about $384 billion. This is the 17th largest economy in the country, the 18th largest employment economy in the country, about 2.9 million covered workers, representing about $337 billion in personal income in 2019. But when we did our study, we did a statewide Minnesota study, but we also zoomed in to do our analysis on 4 specific counties within Minnesota that I'll get into in just a moment. But these 4 counties are Goodhue, Washington, Wright, and Sherburne counties. So I put on this slide a little bit of economic data just to show you the relative size of these economies. So you know, Goodhue County is less than 1% of total employment in the state. Washington County represents about 3% of total employment in the state, Wright County about 1.6%, and Sherburne County about 0.9%. So, you know, collectively, if we're taking a look at employment or GDP or population, it's roughly about 6% of the state's economy, in general. The other thing I'll note here is that 3 out of 4 of these economies reside within the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan statistical area. So that's important when thinking about the labor flow that happens within the metropolitan area, what some of the job alternatives, the substitute jobs are for people when they're within a metro area, versus if it's a very isolated economy in a rural area in Minnesota. When we look at Minnesota's economy and the energy component of their economy, it's relatively small. Crude oil production is nil. They don't really have any crude oil production or natural gas production or coal production. And that'll be important when I go into some of our analysis, because think about what goes into utility, electricity generation in general, and how much of that activity resides within a state versus how much is leaked out of a state. If it's coal-fired production and the state doesn't have coal mining activity, then those dollars for the coal purchases are effectively leaving the Minnesota economy. The state is 28th in electricity generation, 32nd in overall energy, 44th in natural gas prices. But when we get to some of the renewable resources, wind and solar, they actually are above average nationally. And while utility activity is only 1.4% of GDP overall in the state, it is a much greater share in these 4 counties that we looked at. So in Goodhue County, in 2018, it was about 23% of their overall GDP. Now, utility is beyond just electricity, but that provides you some perspective, because that's the level of detail we can look at from the BEA. Sherburne County, it was about 1/4 of their economy. Wright County, it was about 10%. And then Washington County, much smaller percentage of activity, about 2%. When we take a look at electricity generation in Minnesota, it's you can see how the market share has sort of shifted over time. It used to be back in the late 1990s that about 2/3 of electricity generation came from coal-fired production. We also see nuclear as a very significant source of electricity generation in the state of Minnesota. But then you can see that darker gray band, natural gas. It's a growing share of production in the state of Minnesota. And then you can see wind, which is almost equivalent to natural gas production in the state of Minnesota. And then there's other, which also includes solar. Solar is gaining market share, but it's still small enough that I lumped it in with other in the data set. And this just shows that relative market share by energy source over time. And you can see the collapse or convergence by energy source, where coal used to be the dominant source for electricity generation. And now it's sort of equally shared between coal and nuclear and natural gas and wind. So drilling down into our study, this was a project that was in partnership with the Minnesota Center for Energy and Environment. It was in partnership with the host communities within Minnesota, so those same communities that I was sharing, Goodhue County, Sherburne County, Wright County, and Washington County. And it was in partnership with two major utilities in the state, including XCEL Energy. So we all came together with the purpose of studying alternative scenarios, alternative energy plans over the next 20 or 30 years. So there are already energy plans that have been filed with the Public Utilities Commission, have been approved by the commission, and now these two utilities have been looking at it saying, okay, well, what if we deviate from that initial plan and retire some of our coal early? What if we extend nuclear production? What if we replace some of our coal-fired generation with wind or with solar? And so we went through this iterative process where we looked at a whole host of different scenarios that each had different impacts on these host communities. Part of the conversation was sourcing electricity from cleaner sources. We certainly were looking at early retirement of coal and multiple replacement sources of energy. Note that we looked at the gross economic impact as well as the net economic impact, and I'll explain the difference. So when we looked at the net economic impact, this was when we were taking a look at the scenario that was filed with the Public Utilities Commission. So they already have a resource plan and a retirement plan for many of these operating facilities. And what we looked at was the deviation from those plans. So is it less coal? Is it more wind? And so we looked at that net economic impact of the proposed changes over time. But the communities also wanted to know what the gross impact was. So meaning that the retirement is going to be painful for these communities whenever it happens. So if the utilities represent 10 to 25% of GDP in a community, whenever that coal-fired power plant gets retired, that is a difficult transition for that community. So I apologize for my dog in the background. So we did do a gross analysis where we looked at if that utility did not exist in 2018, what would that impact have been on that community? We used the E3 model from REMI. Apologies, REMI. I put implant on the slide. We used the REMI E3 model, which was incredibly helpful for this study, because I've done utility studies in the past where we had to build up the supply chain for doing the analysis. So identifying what the utilities purchase and where they purchase from. REMI now has these custom modules where we can take a look at facility construction and facility operating and maintenance costs for coal, for natural gas facilities, for wind, and for solar, and for nuclear. So that really hit all the marks that we needed for this study in Minnesota. And so I could sort of take that piece of the effort off my plate and focus more on the assumptions and the analysis. I still had to do some customization within the model because, for instance, the model had some local resource sourcing, say coal sourcing, that just didn't exist within the counties. So I still had to do some customization to make sure I wasn't overstating some of those resources that we had inherent in the model. To look at a few of the scenarios, this is that matrix that we were looking at. So we had, this is from XCEL Energy. This is the reference case scenario. That was scenario 1. So that's their plan that they've been operating under. And then we have these alternative scenarios, scenario 2, 4, 9, 10, and 12. And I'm going to focus on scenario 12 because this was the preferred plan from XCEL Energy. So what you can see here is that under the reference case, for instance, they were retiring Sherco 3 in Sherburne County in 2040. In this scenario, we were taking a look at this alternative where they retired Sherco 3 in 2030. So we did that analysis on Sherburne County. What does that 10-year early retirement look like for Sherburne County? In Washington County, this is also a coal producing facility, coal-fired power plant. The original plan had it retiring in 2037. And we looked at this revised idea where they retire coal in Washington County in 2028. And then for these nuclear facilities in Wright and Washington counties, we saw a scenario where nuclear was extended. So instead of retiring the nuclear facility in 2030, they add some capital expenditures to this facility and make the life of this facility end in 2040 instead of 2030. So we gathered a lot of data from the utilities about their capital expenditures compared to the reference case and how those changed. So they had to spend more on the nuclear facility. When they did the early retirement of the coal facilities, there's some decommissioning costs early on, but then we see smaller CapEx going off into the future. Same with operating expenditures, property taxes, and then rates. So revenue requirements was an important attribute that we looked at. Customers are, under these alternatives, are paying less for their electricity in aggregate. And so they have more consumption ability to spend on other goods and services. So we modeled that within our plan as well. And so then how did this sort of net out? This is just taking a look at the net expenditures and revenue requirements. You can see here that the plant operations, so this is both capital expenditures and operating expenditures, really goes down in the 2030s. You can see that the revenue requirements decrease throughout the entire horizon for Minnesota customers. And you can see that property taxes ends up going up on net because they're paying greater property taxes on the nuclear facilities and through the wind and solar. That is in excess of what they were paying at the coal facilities. And so what did this mean for the Minnesota economy overall? We modeled this as a net increase overall statewide because we see greater spending in the state of Minnesota. So remember that coal conversation I had early on. If coal was the major input for electricity generation, and that coal was bought out of state, that was 100% leakage for those coal purchases. And that was the major input for coal power generation in Minnesota. So by shifting that activity to more nuclear, extending nuclear, and shifting that activity, say, to renewable resources like solar, that was primarily in the state of Minnesota, or wind that was primarily in the state of Minnesota, that's really redirecting those coal purchases from leaking out of the state to resources that are nested in the state. As well as coupled with the cheaper energy for customers, this ended up being a boost to the Minnesota economy net. But there are invariably winners and losers when we take a look at these scenarios. So when we take a look at Goodhue County and Wright County, since these are the nuclear producing counties where plants are being extended, during those extended years beyond when it should have been retired, we see an economic boost because they're getting an extended life of a plant. They're getting capital expenditures and operating expenditures and property taxes that they did not expect to have for an additional 10 years. And then the coal producing counties saw a net decrease in their economic activity because those plants are being retired sooner than they would have been retired. So they're sort of foregoing these plant operations that they would have had but for these early retirements. So when we zoom in, there are certainly winners and losers in these scenarios. I want to wrap up by talking about this alternative analysis that we did that was important for the host communities because they just wanted some insight on what it means when any of these plants eventually retire. So what we did was a look back on 2018. We knew what total spending by these power plants was within the communities, and we just modeled it as a 100% decrease in these capital expenditures and operating expenditures. We decreased the direct jobs and the direct wages within those communities. And so we could provide each one of these host communities some insight on what a closure does mean. And that helps with some planning ultimately for these communities, just to know what they need to be looking forward to and how they might prepare for that eventual transition that will happen at some point in time in the future. So we displayed this in terms of jobs, in terms of GDP, in terms of population, and in terms of labor force, and a whole host of metrics that we were able to extract pretty easily from the REMI model using the E3 model. And in addition to that, we provided insight into jobs by industry and really just had that conversation about that multiplier effect, how a decrease in utilities doesn't just impact utilities, it impacts so many other industries because of that indirect impact and because of that impact from the change in household spending. So overall, this was the findings, the summary findings from the Center for Energy and Environment report that included my piece of the study as well as some focus groups that they did with the community. And they noted that the power plant closures will invariably have a negative impact on host communities whenever that happens. We showed some of the alternative ways of looking at this, both an ultimate shutdown as well as a difference from the status quo resource plan with the Public Utilities Commission and these alternative proposals. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to hearing the next presentation before we take Q&A. Thank you.